In the unassuming locale of Marietta, Texas, a local minister enacted a drastic deed, dismantling a sacred effigy in full view of the public. This act triggered more than mere public disapproval. It initiated a profound internal disruption and subsequent reformation for him. Pastor Elijah Carter, a prominent figure in this tranquil community, was recognized for his powerful sermons and his unyielding opposition to any semblance of Catholic customs. He frequently asserted from his pulpit that Catholicism was a display of idolatry concealed by ritual, his voice resonating throughout their humble church structure situated at the town's periphery. He would emphatically declare, brandishing a well-worn Bible like a weapon, that statues possessed no voice, rosaries offered no salvation, and Mary did not act as an intermediary. His congregation, predominantly conservative Baptists, echoed his sentiments, some with deep conviction, others with a quiet, unspoken reservation. Directly across the town square, adjacent to the local diner and occupying the site of the former post office, stood an unpretentious wooden representation of the Virgin of Guadalupe. For numerous decades, it had been a fixture, established by Mexican-American Catholics who had made Marietta their home generations prior. It was not an ostentatious or imposing monument, but rather a serene carving of cedar, its hands clasped in prayer, its gaze gently lowered. To those of faith, it served as a comforting emblem, a maternal presence that offered solace when others could not. Pastor Elijah, however, perceived it as an insult, deeming the floral tributes at its base as misguided veneration, labeling it as superstition and, more severely, heresy. He would frequently point to it during his sermons, even from a considerable distance, stating that the carving was merely wood, devoid of perception, yet people prostrated themselves before it as if the divine resided within carved pine. Despite his pronouncements, no one publicly challenged the statue. In Marietta, a place where ancestral connections were widely known, any confrontation unfolded gradually and discreetly, manifesting as whispers in the diner or sidelong glances at the gas station. The statue, however, had weathered numerous storms, election cycles, births, and funerals. Yet, an internal transformation had begun to take root within Elijah. It was not an abrupt change, but a slow, brewing intensity, much like an impending Texas tempest, initially subtle but escalating with fervor and self-importance. He felt an unnamed sensation that agitated his chest whenever he passed the statue en route to services. Each time a child illuminated a candle beneath it or someone offered a quiet supplication in Spanish, his sermons grew more severe and urgent, shifting focus from grace to what he termed a spiritual conflict, a battle against visible idolatry. His wife, Lisa, observed this shift, a decline in his smiles, a growing number of sleepless nights and solitary drives with no discernible destination. She remained silent, however. Their daughter Abigail, merely 8 years old, would occasionally pause during their walks, gazing upward at the statue with her small hand clasped in his. "She looks kind," Abigail once remarked. Elijah offered no response. The subsequent events would profoundly affect the town and, even more significantly, would reshape Elijah Carter from his very foundations. For it is one thing to preach with fiery conviction and quite another to become the one requiring salvation. It transpired on a Sunday afternoon, a day characterized by the gentle, unhurried pace of life in Marietta, with families dispersed in the park, children flying kites, and teenagers queuing for shaved ice near the courthouse. At the far end of the town square, the statue of the Virgin Mary remained serenely in its customary position, undisturbed. Unbeknownst to anyone, Pastor Elijah carried a hammer concealed within his bag. He had traversed the square with a resolute stride, ignoring greetings, his gaze fixed on the statue as if advancing into a confrontation. Several individuals offered passing nods, acknowledging him as the community's spiritual leader. However, even the familiar cadence of his footsteps on the pavement felt altered that day. He offered no smiles and did not moderate his pace. Lisa had sensed his internal tension throughout the morning. He had not delivered a sermon, citing a need for solitary communion with the divine. While she did not question him, a distinct, almost quivering intensity in his demeanor lingered with her. Upon reaching the statue, Elijah exhibited no hesitation. He ascended the low stone pedestal and unzipped his bag. The metallic gleam of the hammer caught the sunlight. A nearby vendor, selling roasted corn, humorously called out, "Hey, Pastor, what are you doing up there?" Elijah did not reciprocate the light-heartedness. He lifted the hammer and struck the statue with considerable force. The initial impact produced a sharp crack that reverberated across the square like a gunshot. Heads turned, some froze, and a child's scream pierced the air. The second and third blows followed in rapid succession, sending splinters flying and dislodging a fragment of the statue's robe near the hem. Elijah's face was flushed and contorted, not with sorrow or fear, but with an intense, righteous fury. His voice rose above the growing commotion, proclaiming, "This is not holy. This is not God. It's wood. Only Jesus saves." A woman, dropping her ice cream, rushed towards the statue, tears welling in her eyes, pleading, "Please stop. That statue has been here since my grandmother's wedding." Elijah, however, persisted, shouting with greater vehemence, "Do not kneel to idols. Tear them down." With a final, powerful swing, the statue's head became dislodged and fell to the ground with a dull thud, rolling to a halt at the feet of a boy, approximately 10 years of age. The child remained motionless, gazing at it as if a sacred entity had ceased to exist. Onlookers gathered, but none advanced, paralyzed by shock and apprehension. The same minister who had officiated their weddings, baptized their children, and offered prayers at their bedside now stood above them, hammer in hand, breathing heavily, surrounded by fragments of the Virgin Mary. No authorities were summoned, and no one intervened, for this was Marietta, a place where silence often conveyed more than outright protest. Elijah dropped the hammer with a clatter of metal. He scanned the crowd, anticipating what? Applause, nods of approval, or gratitude. Instead, he encountered faces etched with hurt and betrayal. A young woman comforted her grandmother, who had fallen to her knees. A father shielded his child's eyes. An elderly Hispanic gentleman murmured a prayer in Spanish, pressing a small crucifix on his necklace to his lips. Then a soft voice emerged. A woman holding an infant whispered, "You didn't break wood, you broke our hope." With that, Elijah descended. The scattered pieces of the statue lay as evidence of a disruption, but the true upheaval was yet to unfold. The hammer had fallen, the statue was gone, but the subsequent aftermath was far quieter and more devastating. By Monday morning, the town of Marietta avoided direct eye contact with Elijah Carter. At the local diner, where he had previously led informal prayer gatherings over coffee and pancakes, his usual booth remained vacant. Mary, the server, did not refill his coffee cup or take his order, merely gesturing towards the exit. At the grocery store, parents instinctively drew their children closer upon spotting him, not out of fear, but discomfort, conveying an unspoken message of "not now, not here." The bakery discontinued the pastor's custom placeholder sign in their display case. The sign vanished, and with it, the baker's smile. Even the town's canines seemed to fall silent as he passed. Returning home, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Lisa, his wife of 15 years, no longer awaited his arrival at the door. She folded laundry silently, washed dishes without humming, and served meals without grace. Her words, when spoken, were gentle yet distant, as if addressing an unwelcome guest. "Did you eat today?" she inquired once. Elijah nodded. "I went by Miller's." She offered no reply, merely lowering her gaze to her plate and nudging peas to the side. His daughter Abigail, who had once greeted him with an enthusiastic "Daddy's home," now spent extended periods in her room. She had affixed a drawing to her wall, an image of the Virgin Mary, rendered in blue, hands clasped, encircled by yellow crayon stars. One night, he stood before it, experiencing a sensation he hadn't felt in years, an alien presence in his own residence. The church presented an even more somber scene. Sunday arrived. He donned his suit, combed his hair, adjusted his tie, activated the lights, positioned the microphone, and waited. The sanctuary remained unoccupied. No choir, no deacons, no ushers, no congregational voices lifting hymns like, "How Great Thou Art." Only the persistent hum of fluorescent lighting and the creaking of wooden pews settling under their own solitary weight. He proceeded to preach, addressing the void. He returned home alone, Bible in hand, his steps heavier than usual. The streets were silent, not with the peaceful quiet of a Sunday, but with the profound silence of ostracism. In the ensuing days, correspondence arrived. Not threats or expressions of outrage, but simply evidence of absence. Contribution envelopes were returned unopened, church volunteer rosters remained blank, and a resignation letter from the youth pastor was found neatly folded within an offering envelope. The world had not erupted in protest. It had simply receded. Even his voice, once robust and resonant, seemed to diminish. During dinner, he would begin to speak, only for Lisa to rise, collect her plate, and retreat to the kitchen. "You don't comprehend," he finally declared one evening, unable to contain his distress any longer. "I did it for the truth." Lisa looked up, her expression not one of anger or surprise, but profound weariness. "No," she whispered, "you did it for yourself." Abigail coughed from the hallway, a dry hacking sound. It had begun the previous day, a minor fever, Elijah reasoned, attributing it to typical childhood ailments. However, by week's end, her fever escalated, her cough deepened, and her complexion paled. She lay in bed, murmuring incomprehensible dreams and unfamiliar names. Medical professionals conducted numerous tests and prescribed various medications, but to no avail. One evening, Lisa sat by Abigail's bedside, gently wiping the sweat from her daughter's forehead. Without looking up as Elijah entered, she softly stated, "She keeps asking to see the lady in blue." Elijah blinked. "What lady?" Lisa then met his gaze. "You know which one?" He stood frozen in the doorway, the cumulative weight of his words, his sermons, and every impact of that hammer pressing down upon his chest. In the home once filled with devotion, song, and unwavering faith in divine attentiveness, now resided only an expectant silence, not of a sacred nature, but the kind that anticipates an impending collapse. The evenings in the Carter residence had taken on a somber weight. Abigail's fever persisted stubbornly, the prescribed remedies proving ineffective. A humidifier, positioned in the corner of her chamber, emitted a weary sigh, akin to a defeated mechanism. Lisa, usually the embodiment of tranquility and self-possession, now found rest in brief, restless intervals beside their ailing child, murmuring fragmented supplications into the enveloping darkness. Elijah had entirely abandoned sleep. On the third night, just as the pre-dawn light began to touch the horizon, he succumbed to exhaustion on the living room sofa, still clad in his Sunday attire, the buttons of his shirt left undone. His hands were clasped tightly around a Bible, a relic that now seemed to bear an immeasurable burden. He possessed no memory of closing his eyes, but upon reopening them, the world had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer within his familiar living room. He found himself standing solitary in a vast, unbounded expanse. The sky overhead presented a desolate hue, akin to pulverized charcoal, and the wind moaned with a low, lamenting sound, reminiscent of a wounded creature. In the distance, skeletal trees, denuded of their foliage, stretched starkly towards an unseen void. He cried out, "Abigail!" His voice returned to him, a solitary, hollow echo. He began to walk. The ground beneath his worn soles felt parched and fissured, like the desiccated remains of something long surrendered to time. His stride quickened, faltering with each step. A profound sense of dread began to take hold, a fear that did not manifest in outward cries but in insidious whispers. Then, emerging from the indistinct haze ahead, a soft, almost pulsating luminescence appeared. Within the gentle radiance stood a woman. She did not possess an imposing stature nor an ethereal glow, as Elijah might have once envisioned an angelic being. Her appearance was decidedly human, even familiar. She was enveloped in a flowing garment of a subdued rose shade, and draped over her shoulders was a celestial blue mantle. This mantle seemed to drift as if caught in a silent breeze, adorned with faint stellar patterns that shimmered with an ephemeral luminescence, much like the condensation of breath in the biting winter air. Her feet were bare, making contact with the earth as though she were an intrinsic part of it. Above all, her eyes, profoundly deep, dark, and imbued with an unshed gentleness, held him captive. She remained silent, yet her stillness conveyed all that was necessary. Elijah recognized her with an absolute certainty. His mouth parted, a torrent of words spilling forth, driven by an urgent need to explain. I never meant to offend. My intention was to safeguard the truth, or so I believed. She remained motionless, unperturbed, her posture shifting only slightly as she extended her hand, palm open, a silent invitation for him to gaze downwards. And there, dispersed across the earth at her feet, lay the shattered fragments of the statue. These were the very same cedar remnants he had reduced to splinters with his hammer. The severed head, the clasped hands, the celestial motifs from her mantle, now veiled by dust and withered grass, resting as placidly as gravestone. He collapsed onto his knees, his hands trembling uncontrollably. I was defending Jesus. I truly believed I was acting righteously. Still, no words issued from her. Yet her silence was not accusatory, nor was it steeped in anger. It radiated sorrow, coupled with an even deeper sentiment, profound compassion. She took a step forward. The ground beneath her feet did not yield with a crunch, but softened imperceptibly. She reached out, her touch akin to a caress of wind upon skin, and placed her fingers upon his brow. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was a mere whisper, devoid of any echo or reverberation, carrying only the weight of her presence. My son awaits you, but before you rejoin him, you must first grasp a mother's heart. All dissolved. The wind, the field, her touch. He awoke with a sudden jolt, gasping as if abruptly resurfaced from the depths of a submerged world. The clock on the wall indicated the hour of 3:03 in the morning. He sat upright, his body slick with perspiration, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his chest. For an extended period, he remained immobile, his gaze fixed upon the spectral forms dancing across the floor. Then he rose and proceeded down the hallway. Upon opening Abigail's chamber door, the air was perfumed with eucalyptus and the faint aroma of baby powder. She was asleep, but for the first time in days, it was a repose of genuine rest. Her breathing was steady, her complexion no longer ashen, and her small fists relaxed. Lisa, looking up from her place in the rocking chair, her eyes heavy with fatigue, whispered, "She hasn't stirred for hours." Elijah nodded, his voice catching in his throat. "I saw her." Lisa did not inquire about whom he had seen. It was unnecessary. She simply closed her eyes and murmured, "She hears, even when we wound her." The dawn following this profound dream found Elijah subdued in conversation. He moved with a carefulness, as though transporting something exceedingly delicate. It was not precisely fear that governed him, but a heightened awareness. Every sound within the dwelling seemed amplified. The delicate chime of silverware, the creak of the floorboards, even the soft rustle of Lisa turning the pages of the morning newspaper prompted him to lift his head, as if attuned to a voice unheard by others. Abigail continued her peaceful slumber, the fever having receded without returning. At midday, Elijah ventured outdoors for the first time in several days. The sun offered a gentle warmth, free from any harshness. Birds chirped in the surrounding trees, their songs as if no disquiet had intruded upon their world, as if the very fabric of existence had not been rent just days prior. He made his way to the local pharmacy to procure additional rehydration solutions for Abigail. As he retraced his steps, crossing the periphery of the town square, a soft voice called out his name. "Pastor Carter." He turned. An elderly woman stood near a bench situated by the pedestal that now stood conspicuously empty. She was petite, attired in a faded floral dress with a white scarf artfully draped over her shoulders. Her gaze was sharp yet benevolent. He recognized her, Mrs. Delgado, one of the community's most venerable residents of Mexican-American heritage, a woman of quiet disposition, a widow, a devout attendee of Mass, yet a stranger to his own congregation. "I have been awaiting you," she stated. Elijah shifted his weight, uncertain whether to offer an apology or to proceed on his way. "I am not here to admonish you," she added, as though privy to his thoughts. "I have brought you something." She reached into her well-worn leather satchel and withdrew a small package, meticulously wrapped in cloth of a pale blue hue. With deliberate, almost reverent care, she extended it with both hands. He hesitated. "What is it?" she inquired. A gentle smile touched her lips. "Open it." Within the wrapping lay a simple rosary, its beads of a pristine white, smooth to the touch, accompanied by a wooden crucifix and a small silver medallion depicting Our Lady of Guadalupe. Her likeness was virtually identical to that which had been meticulously carved into the statue, but now, held within his hands, it felt less like an artifact of wood or metal and more like a personal emblem. "I cannot accept this," he murmured. "You already have," she replied. "She has been waiting," his voice faltered. "You witnessed what I did." "We all did," she responded. "But she saw more." Elijah's gaze fell upon the rosary beads. They seemed to gleam faintly in the sunlight, as if recalling a truth that had eluded his memory. "She offers forgiveness, Pastor, even when we fail to seek it with the proper intent," the elderly woman added. "Even when we believe we are in the right." He found himself without words, and so he remained silent. Before departing, Mrs. Delgado rested a hand lightly upon his arm. "Even if you cannot articulate it in prayer, simply hold it. It is not about the perfection of words, but about trust." And then she was gone. He stood there for a considerable time, the rosary cradled in both hands, the cloth wrapping brushing against his wrist like a fleeting breath. That evening he did not assume a posture of prayer. He uttered no words. He simply sat in the quiet darkness beside Abigail's bed, his fingers closed around the rosary in silent contemplation. As the beads slid through his grasp, an unexpected wave of recollections surfaced. Not sermons or scripture, but vivid images from years past. His grandmother carefully lighting a candle, his mother whispering over a photograph, a tiny metal charm placed in his lunchbox as he departed for Bible college. A tapestry of all the women in his life who had extended their love without demanding his absolute correctness. The weight of these memories pressed upon his chest, not with the burden of guilt, but with a profound sense of longing. Later that same night, just before the stroke of midnight, Abigail stirred from her sleep. She whispered something softly, her voice barely audible. Lisa leaned closer. "What did she say?" Abigail offered a faint smile. "The lady in blue. She said, 'Daddy's not alone anymore.'" Elijah closed his eyes, and in the profound stillness of that Texan night, with the rosary clasped in his hand and his daughter breathing with ease, the first sliver of light penetrated the protective shell he had worn for far too long. The pedestal remained in its solitary position at the far end of the square, a silent, weathered, and barren testament. Days had elapsed since Mrs. Delgado had entrusted Elijah with the rosary. Each morning thereafter, he had walked past the park, maintaining a respectful distance, never pausing, never direct in his gaze, yet a persistent ache resided in his chest with every passing. It was as though the vacant space where the statue had once stood had become a reflection of his own soul, stripped bare, weathered, and waiting. That Friday morning, the air was heavy with the lingering warmth of late summer, and the sidewalks were strewn with the crisp foliage of an early seasonal shift. Marietta maintained a hushed atmosphere, but it was a silence distinct from its former character. The customary exchanges of neighborly greetings, the unhurried conversations on front porches, and the cheerful presence of children on bicycles had been supplanted by an air of hesitant deference. The townsfolk still observed Elijah, but their gazes no longer burned with indignation. Instead, they averted their eyes, as if sharing in his shame or uncertain of their own sentiments. He had donned a freshly laundered shirt and meticulously pressed his trousers. Tucked within his pocket, the rosary bestowed upon him by Mrs. Delgado lay curled like a slumbering promise. Abigail had once again passed the night in undisturbed sleep. Upon awakening that morning, a noticeable color had returned to her cheeks. As he leaned down to kiss her forehead, she whispered, "Are you going to see her today?" He did not inquire as to whom she referred, offering only a nod in affirmation. Lisa had prepared a small bouquet of flowers, delicate white daisies and lilies, reminiscent of those his mother used to place on her windowsill. She offered no words as he accepted them, but her eyes followed his departure to the door, a silent, fervent plea. Upon reaching the edge of the park, Elijah came to a halt. He sensed the presence of the steps before his eyes registered them. A handful of townspeople were scattered about, seated on benches, walking their dogs, or casually sipping coffee. Their attention was drawn to him. Tentative whispers began to ripple through the air. "Is that Pastor Carter? He's returning. What is he doing?" He proceeded with a measured pace, each step carrying a discernible weight. The area surrounding the pedestal felt transformed. It was not merely empty, but imbued with a sacred aura, as if an unseen essence still lingered there, as if her presence had never truly departed. Upon reaching the base, he paused. Then he knelt. It was not a performative gesture. There were no pronouncements, no arms raised in supplication, no celestial spotlight illuminating the scene. It was simply a man on his knees, placing a small arrangement of flowers upon unadorned stone. His lips moved subtly, his words inaudible to any observer. Yet, from the subtle tremor of his shoulders, from the humble inclination of his head, not in arrogance but in complete submission, it was evident what transpired. He was not delivering a sermon. He was offering an apology, not merely to the town, nor even exclusively to the statue itself, but to the silence, to the grace, and to the maternal spirit. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps could be discerned. Mrs. Delgado materialized beside him, kneeling without a spoken word. Subsequently, another woman joined them, one of the ladies from his congregation whom he had not encountered in weeks. Then another and another. Before long, a small, reverent circle had formed around him. There were no pronouncements, no lectures, only gifts. Some held prayer beads, others simply lowered their gazes. A single gentleman discreetly wiped his eyes. The effigy was still absent, but a profound change had taken place. As Elijah rose, his hands unsteady, he turned slowly. For the first time in weeks, the faces observing him were not rigid with condemnation. They appeared more pliable, filled with curiosity, a touch of apprehension and acceptance. The past could not be erased. The sacred wood could not be made whole again. However, a deeper wound had begun to heal. The house was tranquil that night. It was not the hushed stillness of unease or grief, as in the preceding weeks, but a more serene quietude. It resembled the calm that descends after a tempest, when the window panes cease their rattling and the wind finds its rest. Elijah settled on the edge of Abigail's bed, the prayer beads still encircling his wrist, unnoticed. Lisa was nestled in the nearby armchair, her Bible closed on her lap, having remained unread for many hours. A lamp cast a gentle, golden illumination across the room. Abigail had been asleep since early in the evening. There was no coughing, no shivers. Her respiration carried the cadence of profound, restorative slumber. For the first time in days, the whirring of a fan was absent, as was the chill of a compress and the hushed anxiety from behind the door. Only breath and stillness remained. At 2:17 in the morning, she stirred, her eyelids fluttering, her small fingers flexing against the bed linens. Elijah leaned closer, his heart held captive in his chest, like a clenched fist waiting to unfurl. Abigail's eyes opened, clear, wide, and serene. "My darling," Lisa whispered, already kneeling beside the bed. "Can you hear me?" Abigail gave a slight nod, then turned her gaze toward her father. Then, in a voice not frail, not hoarse, but resonant, as if emanating from a place of newfound stability, she spoke. "Daddy, the lady in blue said I can wake up now." Elijah stood frozen, Lisa's breath hitched. Abigail offered a smile. It was not a smile of weariness, nor hallucination from a fevered state. It was a genuine smile. "She was present," she continued calmly. "She stayed beside my bed every night when I was ill. She held my hand and called me her little blossom." Lisa's eyes immediately welled with tears. She reached out to her daughter, bestowing kisses upon her cheeks, her hands, her forehead. Elijah remained unable to move. His voice cracked. You saw her?" Abigail nodded once more. She wore a dress adorned with stars and smelled of blossoms in the warm air. Then she added, almost as a confidence, "She said you saw her too, but you had to find your path before I could return." The room fell silent once more. Lisa, trembling, looked toward Elijah, who now sat with both hands covering his face. It was not an expression of disbelief, nor of dread, but of an emotion too vast to articulate. Gratitude, resignation, love. Abigail extended her hand. "I can rest now," she said, "and so can you." That night, no one in the Carter household slept. They remained together in that room. The mother, the father, the daughter, enveloped in blankets, in each other, in something intangible yet profoundly real. There were no further checks for fever, no more medication, no more alarms, only peace. By morning, sunlight streamed through the window, its rays dancing upon Abigail's hair. She was awake, walking, conversing, her laughter a faint echo as she watched the cartoons Lisa had activated on the television. When Elijah contacted the doctor later that day, he could offer no explanation. Her test results were normal, her vital signs perfect. "It's as if she was never ill," the doctor remarked, bewildered. "Honestly, Pastor, I'm at a loss for words." Elijah made no attempt to clarify. Some experiences transcend the realm of medical reports. That afternoon, as they sat on the porch sipping lemonade, Abigail looked up at the sky and softly declared, "She smiled at me today from the clouds. I saw her." Lisa placed her hand over Elijah's, and for the first time in weeks, he returned her smile, not because he finally possessed answers, but because his daughter was whole. And somewhere within that enigma, within the quiet smile of a child who had encountered the lady in blue, he too had been made whole. The pedestal in the town square remained vacant for several weeks, like an unhealed wound the community couldn't quite acknowledge. Most inhabitants avoided its gaze. Some remarked they preferred it that way, preferring an empty space to a reminder of what had occurred. Others, in hushed tone, disagreed, leaving fresh floral tributes on the steps as if anticipating a return. Yet, healing often arrives through the most unexpected channels. It was Sister Teresa, a petite nun from the nearby convent, who initiated the first step. She had observed the entire ordeal from the periphery, never speaking publicly, never passing judgment. One morning she visited Elijah, carrying a cardboard box enveloped in linen. Within it lay the fractured remnants of the statue. "We've kept them," she stated gently. "We collected every fragment we could find." The sisters were unsure of the reason then, but perhaps we understand now. Elijah gazed into the box. The cedar was marred and chipped, yet undeniably familiar. The face, though broken, still retained a softness in the curve of its cheek. The stars adorning her mantle, though faded, still caught the light. I can't," he stammered. "You don't have to undertake this task alone," she replied. And he did not. Within days, volunteers began appearing at the community center. Carpenters, artists, retired sculptors, students on a break from school. Some were of the Catholic faith, others were not. Some had never set foot in any place of worship, yet they arrived with brushes, chisels, glue, and a profound silence. Elijah worked alongside them, quietly. He did not lead, he listened. Each fragment he touched, he treated not as mere wood, but as a memory, a confession, a scar. One afternoon, while meticulously sanding a piece of the robe, a teenager inquired, "Do you believe she forgives you?" Elijah paused. "I believe she already has." It took 3 weeks. Some portions of the statue were irretrievable. A hand was missing. Part of the cloak had deteriorated due to exposure to the elements, but a young artist from the convent, Anna, volunteered to carve the absent elements from the beginning, referencing old photographs and community recollections. "They won't be perfect," she cautioned. "They shouldn't be," Elijah responded. "Perfection is no longer the significance of this statue." When the final layer of paint had dried, the town convened in quiet expectation. There were no celebratory banners, no distributed flyers, no microphones, only hushed conversations spreading from one neighbor to another. "She's returning." On Sunday morning, beneath the gentle radiance of the rising sun, the statue stood cloaked in white linen, awaiting the moment. Elijah stood beside it, holding the very same rosary that Mrs. Delgado had presented to him. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with profound respect. Sister Teresa stepped forward and handed him the cord with which to unveil the statue. "Elijah Carter," she declared, "that which was once fractured will now be elevated, not through arrogance, but through penitence." He drew a deep breath and pulled. The cloth descended. Gasps echoed through the square. There she stood, Our Lady of Guadalupe, restored, yet not without its flaws. The fissures remained visible beneath the paint. The newly crafted hand possessed a slightly different form. The stars on her mantle did not gleam precisely as before, but she was complete. And more than that, she was authentic, a testament to mercy that had endured suffering. A mother who returned not with retribution, but with open arms. Tears streamed down countless faces throughout the crowd. Some made the sign of the cross, others simply bowed their heads. Elijah descended from the platform and knelt at the base of the statue. No sermon, no apologies, only his presence. And in that instant, Marietta not only regained a statue, but reclaimed a piece of its own identity. A reminder that even the sacred can be broken and yet retain its beauty. In the months following the statue's reinstallation, a subtle yet undeniable transformation occurred within Marietta. These were not dramatic shifts. The world did not halt its rotation. The heavens did not part. But there was a palpable alteration in the manner people addressed one another, in the duration they paused before casting judgment, in the readiness with which they offered absolution for wounds not yet fully mended. And at the heart of this change was a man no longer striving to be in the right, but learning to be complete. Elijah Carter returned to his congregation, but his return was unlike any before. His sermons became softer. There were fewer pronouncements, fewer moments of finger-pointing. Instead, there were pauses for contemplation, moments of reflection and sincere confessions. He no longer preached against idolatry. He spoke of compassion. He did not urge others to abandon their ancestral customs. He encouraged them to recall the countenance of love that had met him in the desolate landscape of his self-importance. One Sunday, a new face appeared in the rear pew of the Catholic Church. Elijah did not draw attention to himself. He sat quietly, his head bowed, his fingers loosely clasped around a well-worn rosary, the same one, the one that had survived the fervent heat of his certainty. No one whispered, no one stared. They simply allowed him to be. At home, Abigail would still occasionally awaken with a smile, remarking that the lady in blue had visited her dreams. Lisa began lighting a candle each evening before their meal, offering a brief prayer. Sometimes it was Protestant, sometimes Catholic. The denomination no longer held significance. Their home was rebuilt on a foundation of grace, not on labels. Elijah now visited hospitals, prisons too. He no longer went with the intention of converting anyone. He carried no tracts. He did not wield scripture like a weapon. He simply shared narratives of a man who believed he was saving souls, but was, in fact, constructing barriers. Of a child who perceived the face of mercy before her father ever did. Of a mother who waited not in anger, but in silence until her son returned home. One evening, after addressing a gathering at a community shelter, a young man approached him and asked, "Are you the pastor who desecrated that statue?" Elijah offered a gentle smile. "No," he replied. "I am the man she helped to rebuild." And that became his purpose, not to alter people's perspectives, but to share what had transformed his own heart. Occasionally, he received invitations to ecumenical gatherings, bringing together Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, and Pentecostals. He would sit at the table, never asserting expertise, merely bearing witness. And when questioned about his present beliefs, he would simply state, "I believe God communicates through compassion, and sometimes compassion is attired in blue." The statue in the park still bore its marks. The town never attempted to conceal them. Indeed, a few remarked that the effigy now seemed even more hallowed, as if it had endured some ordeal, as if it bore witness to the narrative of every fractured item restored to completeness. During tranquil afternoons, Elijah would frequent that spot with Abigail. Occasionally, they would bring blossoms. At other times, they simply occupied a seat. And whenever a passerby inquired, "Which congregation do you belong to these days?" he would offer a smile and respond, "The one that remains humble in every circumstance, regardless of its posture." He no longer required a raised platform. He himself had transformed into the preached message. Should this account resonate with a part of you, perhaps stirring a recollection, a query, or an ache that is still mending, do not keep it contained. Contribute a comment, express your reflections, or share your quietude. Furthermore, if you are convinced that our world requires an increased volume of such narratives, tales of compassion, of fragmentation yielding to restoration, of a maternal figure patiently awaiting in hues of sorrow, then kindly bestow a like upon this presentation, enroll as a subscriber, and disseminate it to an individual who might be seeking their own path back to solace. For occasionally, a simple story is all that is necessary.